So we're gonna leave the civilization to go into the Normandy jungle. This is how the paratroopers ended up calling this region the jungle. We call this les bocages, hedgerow countries. In fact, from the 13,000 paratroopers that were dropped here, about 60% were misdropped, up to 20 miles from their objective. Now when you land here in this countryside that you're gonna see, it's all hedges and small fields. If you look at this country from the sky, it looks like a patchwork. And so if you land here among those hedges, well, you have no idea where you are in the dark. And if you see a church tower from a distance, well, they'll look alike. So that's why they call this the jungle. That's what we call les bocages, hedgerows. And now the reason why we have those hedgerows all around the place is because we are on a peninsula, a half island. In fact, we have Utah Beach at 4 miles distance there, but at 40 miles distance that way we have the sea as well. And at the end, Cherbourg. There's a point in the sea. So the altitude is not very high. We are at about 30 feet from the sea level. So about 30 million years ago, this peninsula did not exist. It was covered by the ocean. Long time ago. Back then you went to the beach in Tennessee. Of course the ocean went back and the peninsula appeared. Which means that right now we are in fact driving on the old bottom of the ocean.
Wow.
Which is not very deep, it's about 3 foot deep. Once you dig a hole here, you will bounce on the old bottom of the ocean, which is a kind of a limestone layer. Rocks, stones, So in the beginning of the agriculture, 2,000 years ago, that people started farming, plowing those fields. Well, those rocks came up all the time. So every year the farmers picked up the rocks and they piled them up on the sides of the fields. And this is what caused those bumps to be. In fact, those are piles of rocks collected through the centuries. Either made piles or walls. Now back then, instead of barbed wire, they made fences out of branches of trees that they cut, put into those piles of rocks to make fences. Well, they ended up with growing, and this is how we ended up with all those hedgerows.
Wow.
Long story, just to tell you that those hedgerows, you see, it's very therapeutic. It puts everything back in place. Those hedgerows are extremely strong.
Oh yeah.
In fact, they're stronger than concrete because it's all rocks and roots. And this caused a big problem to the 4th Infantry Division that landed here on Utah Beach with the tanks. They thought, oh, we're gonna cross this easily with our tanks. But not at all. Because when you bounce into this with a tank, well, you will go up and down. Bonjour. She's probably not French. You will go up and down. Now, the problem is that those tanks were barely armored from underneath. The American Sherman tanks. Very thin. Well, the Germans, they knew that. They were hiding behind those hedges with the so-called Panzerfaust or Panzerschreck bazookas. And they hit those tanks underneath. So those rockets went in and bang, they exploded from the inside. That's why they ended up calling those American tanks that usually you call Sherman tanks, they call those pressure cookers.
Yeah, Tommy cookers, right?
There you go, yeah. Fortunately, lots of tank drivers realized that issue before getting hit and returned to the beaches where they picked up those steel obstacles left by the Germans that they cut and welded in front of the tanks to make a kind of a fork system to rather push through this instead of going up and down. Kind of contraptions that have been invented on the terrain. It's one of the single advantages of a war, it's creativity.
Yeah.
You're well dressed to drive a tank.
Yeah.
I have the same, but it's too short or too cold.
Yeah, this one hikes up just a little bit.
Yes. Yeah. Now the reason of D-Day, why it all started here, is that after 4 years of occupation of this continent by the Germans, the Allies recruited England. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, Americans, Canadians, The Supreme, well, the first thing that they knew is that you cannot liberate Europe with 2,000 soldiers here and 3,000 there. You have to be able to put hundreds of thousands of soldiers on this continent, coming from England. Now, to put hundreds of thousands of men on this continent, you absolutely have to start with taking a harbor, a port, somewhere along the Atlantic coast, an entrance. So the first objective becomes a harbor, somewhere along the Atlantic coast. Now the problem is that the Germans have built the so-called Atlantic Wall. From Norway to Spain, the entire Atlantic coast was protected. Just as every harbor, every port was protected by an average of 30,000 German soldiers per harbor. Those were real fortresses. But still they had to find among those harbors a vulnerable one, the one that they could potentially take. So Montgomery and Eisenhower, with this task, they took themselves a kind of a map of the Atlantic coast to analyze harbor by harbor, which one can we potentially take. They even started analyzing Scandinavia, Finland, Norway, Sweden. Well, they forgot about that idea, because even if they had successfully landed there, they would have had to go through the North Pole to go to Berlin, which doesn't make sense. If you analyze further down the map, you have Denmark with Copenhagen. Well, Copenhagen is like an island connected with bridges, so there you may get locked up, so it's not a good idea either. Going further down the map, Germany. Well, that would have been total suicide, of course. No way. Still going down the map, the Netherlands, Holland and Belgium. Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Antwerp. But those harbors are at the end of estuaries inland. So way too well protected as well, so not a good idea. Well, the first thing that they knew is that you cannot liberate Europe with 2,000 soldiers here and 3,000 there. You have to be able to put hundreds of thousands of soldiers on this continent, coming from England. Now, to put hundreds of thousands of men on this continent, you absolutely have to start with taking a harbor, a port, somewhere along the Atlantic coast, an entrance. So the first objective becomes a harbor, somewhere along the Atlantic coast. Now the problem is that the Germans have built the so-called Atlantic Wall. From Norway to Spain, the entire Atlantic coast was protected. Just as every harbor, every port was protected by an average of 30,000 German soldiers per harbor. Those were real fortresses. But still they had to find among those harbors a vulnerable one, the one that they could potentially take. So Montgomery and Eisenhower, with this task, they took themselves a kind of a map of the Atlantic coast to analyze harbor by harbor, which one can we potentially take. They even started analyzing Scandinavia, Finland, Norway, Sweden. Well, they forgot about that idea, because even if they had successfully landed there, they would have had to go through the North Pole to go to Berlin, which doesn't make sense. If you analyze further down the map, you have Denmark with Copenhagen. Well, Copenhagen is like an island connected with bridges, so there you may get locked up, so it's not a good idea either. Going further down the map, Germany. Well, that would have been total suicide, of course. No way. Still going down the map, the Netherlands, Holland and Belgium. Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Antwerp. But those harbors are at the end of estuaries inland. So way too well protected as well, so not a good idea. Okay, further down the map, France. But the Pas de Calais, the region of the Pas de Calais where the channel is so narrow. From the very beginning, Hitler was convinced that if something would come, it would be there, because it's more logical. There he had built this Atlantic Wall with 3 times as much intensity as anywhere else. They expected the Allies to land. But the Allies, they knew that they were expected, so they thought for sure we're not going to land where we are expected. But we're gonna pretend we're gonna do it. We're gonna act we're gonna do it. That's why across the Pas de Calais, in the region of Dover in England, they put in place those divisions. Divisions that did not exist. A division of inflatable tanks developed by Holland, like balloons. Cardboard trucks. Under the command of General Patton. Even days before D-Day, they started moving without instructions. A little bit like in the Flintstones, you know, running around. They took off with bombers that dropped aluminium foil confettis in front of the radars in the Pas de Calais. dummy paratroopers, little dolls. So that in Berlin they were convinced that it was taking place there. But that's fake. It was called Operation 43. So then they thought we're going to pretend we're going to do it, but we know we're going to do it. Now going further down the map, finally you reach this region. This region where the shape of the coast is an opportunity. Because it is a peninsula, the Health Islands. And at the end of the world behind us, we have a big harbor, Cherbourg, also protected by 30,000 men. But from the seaside, not from the inland. Then they thought, there we have our vulnerable harbor. We're going to take Cherbourg, not from the seaside, but from behind. So how shall we do it? Well, let's land on the beginning of this peninsula over there, and let's cut it off. It's only 40 miles. And once it is cut off from the rest of the world, we do the big cleaning from behind and take Cherbourg from behind. And once we have Cherbourg, well, we're going to use it for the days, weeks, and months to come. This is typically Operation Overlord, objective the harbor of Cherbourg. Let me just show that on a little map, because I keep on talking and, you know, and you've never been here, so...
I know the history. I am
okay, good.
just new here.
Yeah. So, this is our Atlantic coast. Norway, Scandinavia, etc. Germany, Holland, Belgium, the Pas de Calais, France, where this channel is so narrow, and so on, and we are here now. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers here that need to get there. Therefore, you need to take a harbor to begin with. But all those harbors are protected from this side, but not from that side. This is why when they analyze the map, they say, hey, here, this is an opportunity. It's a point in the sea. Big harbor, Cherbourg, protected from this side, but not from that side. So there they said, hey, you know what? Let's land here, and let's cut it off. In fact, I need to hold the map like this, because we are here right now. Utah Beach is there. And the other coast 40 miles that way. So let's land there and let's cut it off. And then we're going to take this from behind. In the meantime, when they came to this idea, they thought it may perhaps take a little while before we take Cherbourg. Some British engineers said, why don't we take some harbors with us? The Americans thought they are completely nuts. But go ahead, do your thing. And the British developed the harbors called Mulberry harbors, artificial harbors. So discreetly, months before D-Day, they built in all those harbors concrete pontoons, elements, to take over and to sink from June the 7th, like an IKEA kit, and make 2 artificial harbors.
Wow.
Yeah. Those are the Mulberry harbors. Yeah, are you familiar with Mulberry? Yes.
Yeah.
When you're next to the place where I guess you are, is not far from Arromanches, where you still have a Mulberry Bee visible. But the idea is to take Cherbourg. This is an old washing place.
Wow.
This is where ladies used to do the laundry. This is 1600 years old. Yeah, from the 4th century. They also call this a local newspaper.
Wow.
Where ladies doing the laundry. So, the beach is there, as I said, Cherbourg behind us. So good plan, let's cut off this peninsula. But now they had to succeed, and therefore they decided to engage 120,000 men. First hour, first day, D-Day. 120,000 men that they had to place to land somewhere at the beginning of this peninsula. But you cannot put 120,000 men on the same spot. Therefore, you need a sufficient amount of landable beaches where you can put them all. Okay, so with this idea in mind, they took themselves a map of this peninsula to identify the nearest landable beach to Cherbourg. Well, the nearest beach where you can technically land is the beach that's going to be in front of us, which was called La Plage de la Madeleine. Well, they chose that as a landing beach, but named it after a state in the United States, Utah. And why Utah? Because in Utah there's no beach. Confusing. And they estimate that they could put a maximum of 23,000 men at once there. That's very nice, but it's not enough. They need it for 120,000. So this is why they had to choose an extra beach, which is of course further away. a landable beach. Well, the next landable beach is the beach of Vierville-sur-Mer. Well, they choose that one as well. And named it after a big town in Nebraska, Omaha, and there's no beach either. And there they estimate 29,000 men. Okay, but now we are still at 50,000, not enough. And this is why they choose further the beaches of Gold, Juno and Sword. In fact, they expanded over about 60 miles of beaches. Now, why Gold, Juno and Sword? You know that?
No.
It has to do with fish. Goldfish, swordfish. Now, Juno is not a fish. They wanted to call that jellyfish. And that's not a nice fish. There was a Canadian general that was to land there. He said we cannot do that to our folks. That's a dirty fish. Okay, well how shall we call it then? He said I have no clue. He said, but from the other hand, the nickname of my new girlfriend is Juno. So let's call it Juno. So it's very romantic, that's why it's called Juno. To come back about the occupation, France was invaded May the 10th, 1940. Blitzkrieg. A few weeks later, June the 18th, 1940, the Germans were here already. With the first idea to get over, take England, but then it became immediately, well, he's the German. So taken prisoner right 40 feet a second. It takes about 1 second back. About here. You see what Forrest got again with his own helmet in his hand? We're gonna go to the same spot, so you.
Okay.
He's 502, he's Flanagan. Easy Company 506, 502. So they were standing exactly between those two doors. You see the now it's color of a picture, but it's not a color one. It's someone who did that. It's built after the war on bunkers because it's good basements, good foundations. But here we are, in fact, at a coastal battery. So it is a coastal battery. Well, a coastal battery is always set up with two guns. The inland batteries were usually set up with 4 guns aiming towards the sea. While along the coast it was always about little stuff that I personally, well, even done with a lot of respect. I mean, it's kind